Hey friends, this is Pastor Rice at Beulah ATL. I'm excited because this month, in the month of July, we are shifting to a new Bible study series called Inside Out, learning how to manage your emotions. We just saw all across the country the new film Inside Out 2, which shows us the emotional spectrum that all of us have to go through. As we grow and journey and evolve, our emotions change and develop. And this month, during the month of July, we want you all to join us for Word on Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram Live. Learn how to manage your emotions just a little bit better. Help us to grow up in God. We can't wait to see you every Wednesday in the month of July at 7 o'clock p.m. God bless you. We love you. Good evening, friends. This is Pastor Rice at Beulah ATL. We are delighted to welcome you all to Word on Wednesday Inside Out edition. Thank you all so much for joining us, whether you are a member or a friend of Beulah ATL. We welcome you on this Wednesday night for the second installment. Last week, we had an awesome, dynamic conversation talking about Inside Out, learning how to manage our emotions. We understand that it is important for us to manage our emotions, not only from a psychological perspective, but also from the perspective of what? Of a spiritual perspective. The Bible tells us, beloved, above all things, I would that you would be in good health and that you would prosper even as your soul, your mind would prosper. And so tonight, we're going to take a deep dive back into Inside Out Word on Wednesday edition for the entire month of July. We're talking about learning how to manage our emotions. As always, I want to ground us and center us in a moment of prayer. Wherever you are, I want to invite you now to pause, to take a moment to put your hands flat on the surface that is in front of you. If you have the opportunity to be able to put your feet flat where you are, that would be so beneficial to you because it gives you the opportunity to be able to breathe in and to breathe out. As we talk about managing our emotions, it's also important for us to create space and to curate an opportunity for us to breathe in a way that allows us to inhale the goodness of God and exhale all of the toxicity of the work day, of the work week, of family life, of marriage, whatever the case may be. Let's take a moment to center ourselves now in prayer. God, we thank you for the opportunity to be able to come before your throne of grace again. God, we thank you for the opportunity to be able to study, to show ourselves approved. God, we thank you for this is a day that you have made. We choose to rejoice and we will be glad in it. Help us to think through the implications, the precepts, and the principles that you have laid out in this text for us tonight as we talk about learning how to manage our emotions just a little bit better, not even from a Christocentric view, but just from the perspective of growing up in you and becoming more mature and better human beings. In your precious and holy name we pray. And the people said, amen. Friends, again, thank you all for joining us tonight. We are starting with the second installment of Inside Out, Word on Wednesday for the month of July. I want to invite your attention this evening to a very peculiar passage of scripture. Some of you all may already be familiar with this passage, as it is a passage that has been used over and over again for a multiplicity of reasons. But tonight, I want us to look at this passage as we think about what it means to manage our emotions and to manage them well. Philippians chapter number 4. Philippians chapter number 4, and I want to take the time to look at verses 6 and 7. I'm reading from the New International Version tonight. Philippians chapter number 4, reading verses 6 and 7. Here's what the New International Version says. It says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." This is a really interesting text tonight. And one of the reasons that this is an interesting text is because it in some ways helps us to think through the implications of what it means to be both Christian and what it means to be human. This text is written by an individual by the name of the Apostle Paul, who many of us are acutely familiar with. And as we listen to the language of the Apostle Paul tonight, Paul tells us to be anxious for nothing. Paul tells us that we ought to have no cares. That is what one translation says. Care for nothing. And we are going to dive into that tonight. But tonight, I want to introduce to us the emotion of anxiety. If you all have seen the film Inside Out, you all will know that there are a couple of emotions that show up on the emotional spectrum. But tonight, I want us to deal with the emotion of anxiety and to wrestle with the inner complexities and do a textual analysis on the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians, because Paul says it so confidently. Paul says it so smoothly, as if Paul has never been in an anxious situation before or anxiety ridden. And so tonight, I want us to take a moment to look at anxiety. But before we do, for those who are tardy to the party or those persons who may not have joined us last week, I want to go back and do a recap, because before we deal with anxiety, I want us to deal with anger again. I want us to think about a recap of Riley's experiences. Riley has some very interesting experiences in the film called Inside Out. And as we look at all of the emotions that Riley had to deal with when puberty showed up and rocked her world, what the Professor Michael Jackson at Harvard Divinity School would call a shock of the new. It is this kind of phenomenological unpacking of something new that took place. We discovered that anger is not necessarily a pejorative emotion. It's not a negative emotion. All of the emotions are valid, and we need all of the emotions on the emotional spectrum to be able to navigate the nuances of our narrative and our lives. And so as we look back on last Wednesday's conversation, we will remember that sometimes our emotions are disguised as something else. We looked at the feeling wheel by the psychologist Gloria Wilcox, and what we discovered is that sometimes what we are mad about or angry about is not what we're really mad or angry about. Here's what one psychologist and therapist said. She said, "I sat with my emotions long enough until I realized that anger's real name was grief." Isn't that amazing how sometimes we may think we are angry in a moment, but when we really take a moment to step aside or step back from whatever it is that we are experiencing, we can look at the feeling wheel and discover that what we're mad about, what we're angry about, what we're upset about is not actually what we are mad about. And so what this psychologist said is that sometimes grief is the price that we pay for loving people. Anger and grief in many ways are first cousins, in the same way we will discover tonight that anxiety is similar to panic attacks and depression in many ways. Why is this important as we propel ourselves into the conversation tonight on anxiety? Because our nervous system responds to triggers that are deeply embedded within us, and it reacts to the trauma that is also within us as well. Trauma never leaves the body. There is a book called The Body Keeps Score, and in this book, the name of the author escapes me at the moment, but the author helps us to understand that trauma never leaves your body, and you can be triggered at any moment, you can be triggered at any time, and you have a responsibility to do the work on yourself so that you are not traumatized and triggered by various events that happen in life. Let me say this about anger, and I'll move on to anxiety. What we must learn to realize, friends, is that we are not responsible for what happens to us, but we are responsible for the way in which we respond. Let me say that again. We are not responsible for what happens to us, but healing is your responsibility. How you bounce back from your triggers and your trauma, it is your responsibility. You may not be able to help what happened to you, but Riley teaches us in Inside Out that you are responsible for your own emotional intelligence. And here's why: because we all have suppressed and repressed emotions that need to be expressed. Let me say it again. We all have repressed and suppressed emotions that need to be expressed. It is what one of those R&B artists from the 70s and 80s said a long time ago. They said, express yourself. Why is that the case? I'm going to be vulnerable tonight and share with you all some of the notes from my own therapy sessions. My therapist, when I was in the bowels of depression, said, Kenny, your emotions are nothing more than energy in motion. And if you do not do anything anything with your emotions are eventually going to do something with you. Ooh, I gotta say it again. Your emotions are nothing more than energy in motion. And if you allow the energy in your body to remain dormant and to become stagnant, your emotions are going to deal with you if you don't deal with your emotions. And tonight, as we do a recap of Riley's emotions from last week, we discovered that she was angry about some things, but the things that she was angry about really weren't the things that she was upset about. And so tonight, I want to shift our conversation from the emotion of anger to the emotion of anxiety. Oh, this is going to get tight, but it's right. I want us to look at some antidotes from anxiety, because anxiety is a new emotion that showed up when Riley was going through something called puberty. For those who may not know what that is, the best way I can sanitize it is to tell you that your body is going through some changes, and as a consequence of your body going through changes, your hormones, that is your testosterone and your estrogen levels, begin to change. And as a consequence of your emotions and your hormones changing, you change, because as we grow and develop and evolve, our emotions grow and develop and evolve as well. If you've seen the film, I don't want to give it away, but if you've seen the film, you will understand that puberty showed up one day. And when puberty showed up in Riley's life, her world got turned, flipped upside down by this new emotion called anxiety. And the challenge with anxiety is that anxiety was extremely controlling. Anxiety had to have her hands on everything at all times. As a matter of fact, we're going to see it in a few moments. Anxiety and joy end up going head to head, and they have a blow, because anxiety, though she had good intentions, she caused more harm than she did good. Can I say that again? Anxiety meant to be helpful, but because she could not control herself, instead of her being helpful, she actually ended up being harmful to Riley. And here's why: because anxiety causes us to miss our now, because we are hyper focused on our next. Oh, I gotta say it again. Anxiety can cause us to miss our now because we are hyper focused on our next. If you remember the film, you will remember that Riley was trying out for the hockey team, and she wanted to make the varsity team as she was moving to the 9th grade. She was moving to high school. She was wrestling with her identity. And as she was wrestling with her identity, as her body was changing, as her brain was growing and expanding, this new emotion, as a consequence of puberty, steps in, and all of a sudden Riley is having an identity crisis because an unnamed, unexpected emotion has shown up and taken over the control board. Have you ever been there, child of God? Friends, have y'all ever been there where you experienced a shock of the new? You had some new emotions to show up, and you said, hold on, wait a minute, I don't even know where this emotion is coming from. I don't even know where all of these feelings are coming from. Riley was feeling all the feels, and Riley had to take a step back and say, wait a minute, I think I'm having an anxiety attack. And I want you to know today, friends, that if we are not careful, anxiety can cause us to miss our now if we are hyper focused on our next. Let me also say this for free. Your ability to be effective in your next is predicated upon your ability to be present in your right now. And some of us are living in the middle of prayers that have been answered, and we still are anxiety ridden because we're so focused on what is in the next chapter that you can't appreciate the chapter you're in. Listen, when you know who the author of the book is, you don't have to worry about what's coming in the next chapter because you trust the author with your life. And some of us, just like Riley, have experienced anxiety attacks because we were trying to figure out what's going to happen in the next chapter of my life. Am I ever going to get married? Am I ever going to be the bride and not the bridesmaid? Am I ever going to be the groom and not a groomsman? Because some of us are so concerned about our next, we don't have the ability to be present in our right now. But I dare somebody who's viewing on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram tonight to type in the chat, I'm focused on my now, not my next. It doesn't mean you don't prepare for your next. It does not mean that you don't go to school and get the degree. It doesn't mean you don't go to therapy and work through things to be prepared for your next relationship or your next job, whatever the case is. But your ability to be effective in your next season is predicated upon your ability to be present in this one. And if you cannot master the ability to be effective in your now, anxiety will try to take over for you. As a matter of fact, I got Bible for you. One of the reasons that you ought not be anxious in whatever it is that you are going through is because the Bible tells us in Psalms, many are the plans of a man's heart, but it is ultimately the purpose of God that prevails. My Aunt Diane, God rest her soul, said, if you want to make God laugh, just tell God what you have planned. And see, the trick of the enemy or the adversary or even your inner me, because sometimes your greatest enemy is your inner me. The greatest trick of your inner me or your enemy is to mess with your mind. And that's why you got to keep your mind not only stayed on Jesus, but you got to keep your mind present in your right now, because you may have plans to do X, Y, and Z in your future, but ultimately it is the purpose of God that prevails in our lives. And I want to remind somebody today, as we look at some antidotes from anxiety, I want us to think about the fact that all of us are greater than our thoughts. Therefore, we should not overthink it. Somebody ought to put that in the chat tonight. Don't overthink it. Your ability to be present now affects your ability to be effective in your next. All right? I want everybody to hear me and hear me well. Don't overthink things. Riley was up all night long trying to figure out whether or not she was going to make the hockey team, because some of her girlfriends told her that you're going to have to score 3 goals in order to make the team, and the coach needs to like you. So what did Riley do? Anxiety had her to turn her back on her friends, the ones who had been there. They were her day ones. They were her ride or dies. They were her ace boom coons. And she turned her back on her friends because she began to overthink her next, and it messed up her ability to be present in her right now. You are greater than the thoughts that you have about yourself, and you are greater than what other people think of you as well. And that's why every day, just as you see in this graphic on the screen, you need to wake up and speak life over yourself. Speak positive affirmations over yourself, that I am the head and not the tail. I'm above and not beneath. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. My lips are just the right size. My nose is just the right width. My hair is just the right texture. And I'm not engulfing or engendering the logic of white supremacy that tells me that I'm not good enough. Yes, I am. And yes, you are. Anxiety will have you thinking that you are not good enough. It is in some ways akin to the notion of imposter syndrome. And so we discover that Riley has to reach a place where she realizes, take a chill pill and go to sleep, girl. She was trying to break into the coach's office to see what the coach had written about her in her little notebook, and she wanted affirmation. See, some of us overthink things and we allow anxiety to push us to the edge, because what we are really trying to wrestle with is insecurity. I'm going to get to that in a minute on The Feeling Wheel by Gloria Cox. But as we look at this film, and we extract some exegetical embellishment from the movie Inside Out, and we get a message and a movie. Riley has some challenges getting a grip on her emotions because some new emotions show up and she has completely lost control of herself. Here's what I want to help us to understand. Overthinking and anxiety almost caused her to lose herself and to lose those whom she considered her friends. Anxiety almost caused her to lose what was important to her. Anxiety almost caused her to not only have a nervous breakdown. And when people say that, what they really mean is that your nervous system is breaking down, because your emotions are rooted in some ways in a chemical understanding of neuropathy, excuse me. And so what is really happening is that as a consequence of the anxiety that she is feeling, as a consequence of her hormones being all over the place and this shock of the new, she's beginning to lose herself, and her friends don't recognize her anymore. Riley, are you sure everything is all right with you? Riley, do you need to talk to somebody? Riley, you haven't quite been acting like yourself. Have y'all ever been there, friends? When people said so and so, you really haven't been yourself the last couple of days, the last couple of weeks. And it may be that anxiety is taking over your metaphorical control board and you don't even know what's going on. Here's what the theologian Paul Tillich tells us, that we must learn to accept our unacceptable selves. And Riley teaches us that we must learn to accept all of ourselves and all of our emotions, which means the good emotions and the bad emotions. Riley learned to accept that anger is a part of the emotional spectrum, but she had a hard time navigating through the nuances of anxiety, because anxiety was so concerned about every little thing being right. It's almost as if anxiety had been diagnosed herself. How you diagnosing the diagnosis? It's almost as if anxiety was a perfectionist. And see, some of us are going to drive ourselves to a place where we no longer have peace because you are trying to be a perfectionist. Listen, you will never be perfect because you are in process. You will always be growing, and you must learn to accept your unacceptable self. Now, let me be clear. That does not mean that you get to talk to people any kind of way and pop off on people whenever people get on your everlasting nerves and say, this is just the way that I am. No, 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 no. You must still be responsible in the way that you interact with other individuals. But Riley helps us to understand that you must learn to accept all of your emotions on the emotional spectrum. And in order for you to get a better understanding, I want you to take a moment to watch this video as Riley is trying out for the hockey team, and she has a moment where she spirals into a place where she can't recover from. Take a look at this video.
Choose who Riley is. I'm sorry. I was meant to choose who Riley is. I'm a good person. What are you doing? But I get scared. Success is I make us strong. You need help sometimes. No.
Wow, Riley is literally having what is known as an anxiety attack in the midst of a hockey tryout season. She is having a hard time getting a grip on her emotions, and she spirals and spirals because the more anxiety tries to control things, the worse things get. Is that not a word for somebody tonight? The more anxiety tried to control things and have her hand on the control board, the worse things got for Riley. And I've got to pause there parenthetically tonight because I'm talking to somebody. You can identify with Riley, or you might be able to identify with the Apostle Paul, because the more her emotions, the more anxiety tried to control things, the worse things got. Friends, can I tell you that when you learn to take your hands off of certain things, that's when God can put God's hands on everything, and you'll see God's hands in everything. Some of us need to learn to take our hands off of stuff. Take your hands off of the financial matter. Take your hands off of the fraternal or the familial matter. You cannot control everything. I'm preaching better, teaching better than somebody is saying amen in the chat. You can't control everything. And the more you try to control it, sometimes the worse things get. I'm talking to you tonight, not your spouse, not your girlfriend. I'm talking to you. The more you try to control things, the more you try to shape the narrative, the more you try to be hands-on, sometimes that's when things get even worse. And Riley had to understand, if I'm going to make the team, then I'm going to make the team. And if I don't make the team, that's okay too. I got a word for somebody tonight. You need to get comfortable with the fact that it is okay to not be okay. It's okay if you don't make the team. It's okay if you don't get invited to lunch. It's okay if certain people don't like you. You will literally drive yourself crazy if you are always trying to control every possible scenario and come up with a hypothetical solution before the problem even arises. I gotta say it one more time for the people watching on Instagram tonight. You will literally drive yourself crazy if you try to keep on coming up with hypothetical resolutions to problems that don't even exist yet. Riley's mind could not rest at night because anxiety had her tossing and turning all night long about hypothetical situations that did not even exist yet. And the reality is, friends, some of us have stayed up all night long tossing and turning over hypothetical situations that don't even exist. Come on, let's be real. What if the date goes wrong? What if the person doesn't like me? What if I go for the job interview and they don't hire me? What if I try to become a member of a fraternity or a sorority and they reject me? Listen, honey, you better thank God for rejection, because every rejection is nothing more than God's redirection. You must learn to accept your unacceptable self and tell anxiety, you do not control me. Tell anger, you don't control me. Tell sarcasm, tell embarrassment, tell sadness, you don't. Tell joy, you don't control me. And that's what I love about Riley. Riley finally gets to a place where her anxiety begins to subside. But I want us to look at the feeling wheel tonight by Dr. Gloria Wilcox, because Gloria Wilcox helps us to understand that sometimes the emotions that we're feeling are not really the emotions that are being expressed. One more time, the emotions we may be feeling are not really the emotions that we are expressing. In a moment, I'm going to get to this book by Dr. Tima Bryant called Homecoming. And she helps us to understand in this book, she's the president, a Black woman. She's the president of the American Psychological Association. And in this text, she helps us to understand that you can experience two emotions at the same time. You can experience a multiplicity of emotions at the same time, as it was with the case with Riley in the film Inside Out. If you look carefully in the upper right section between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock. Welcome to those who are tardy to the party on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. If you're looking at the feeling wheel diagram with me, you will see the light purple violet color section of the feeling wheel is titled scared. But behind the emotion of scaredness is the emotion of anxiety. And sometimes our anxiety shows up in such a way that it presents as though we are scared. I told you last week, and I'll say it again, sometimes what you're mad about is not what you're really mad about. As we learned last week with anger, so it is with anxiety. What you're scared about ain't really what you're scared about. Some of us think we're scared, but the reality is you're not scared, you're anxious. Some of us think we're scared, but the reality is you're not scared, you are insecure. And your insecurity allows you then to turn to the degree that you have imposter syndrome. So every room you walk into, you begin to question yourself. You begin to question your worth. Baby, if you don't get a grip, I'm not saying you can't have your emotions. I'm not saying you can't have your feelings, but sometimes what you're scared about ain't what you're really scared about. Sometimes you are not scared, you're insecure. Sometimes you're not scared, you are anxious. And sometimes you're not scared. According to the feeling wheel, you may be feeling the emotions of weakness, of foolishness, of embarrassment, helplessness, rejection, confusion, insignificance. bewilderment, or discouragement. All of those emotions are lumped together in the larger category of scared. For those who were not with us last Wednesday for the Word on Wednesday Inside Out edition, which we're teaching about all throughout the month of July, there are 6 major emotions and categories of which we can group all of the other emotions. There is peacefulness, powerfulness, joyful, scared, mad, and sad. And in the category of scared is where we see anxiety being written. And sometimes we can show up in the world with our scared selves because anxiety is gripping our control board. But I want you to declare today, anxiety, you don't get to control me. Scaredness, you don't get to control me. I'm showing up as scared, but I'm really anxious. I'm showing up as scared, but I'm really embarrassed. I'm showing up as scared because I got rejected and I don't want to get rejected again, because I don't want to be hurt again. Am I helping anybody tonight? I'm showing up as scared because I don't want to submit, because if I submit, I'm in a place of vulnerability. And the last time I was in a place of vulnerability, person A, B, and C hurt me. And so I'm scared to love again. I'm scared to try again. I'm scared to step out on faith again. Am I coming through with anybody tonight? Sometimes the emotions that you are experiencing are not the emotions that you are presenting. You may present as though you are scared, but what you are feeling is anxiety. And that's what happened to Riley in the film called Inside Out. She presented as if she was scared, but the reality is she was not scared. She had anxiety because she was trying to control the future. But I want you to know you can't control the uncontrollable. There's a powerful, powerful prayer that says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change and to control the things that I can. And I want you all to get that prayer embedded in your mind. I want you all to get that prayer subdued in your consciousness. I want you all to massage this message into your memory. Sometimes you need to think back on that prayer and remind yourself. Maybe that would have helped Riley to realize, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change and to control the things that I can. You cannot control everything. And that's where anxiety has got us all types of messed up. And so there's this book by Dr. Tima Bryant. Again, she's the president of the American Psychological Association. And the name of this book is called Homecoming: Overcome Fear and Trauma to Reclaim Your Whole Authentic Self. And she helps us to understand the importance of understanding our not only emotional intelligence, but being sensitive to the emotional intelligence of other people as well. Here's what Dr. Bryant says in this text. Dr. Bryant says, emotional intelligence is the capacity to be tuned in and to regulate your feelings and to relate to others in a way that takes into consideration their emotional experience as well as your own. In other words, translation, the reason we need to learn how to manage our emotions and the reason we've got to study ourselves from the inside out is because as we think through the implications of our own emotional intelligence, we also relate to other people in a more dynamic and thorough way. Dr. Lawrence Edward Carter, the dean of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel at Morehouse College, said this when I was a student: if you go deep enough in yourself, eventually you will come up in other people. As an 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-old, I didn't know what Dean Carter was talking about. But what Dean was trying to get us to understand is that if you just do the homework on yourself, everything else around you will come out okay. I gotta say it one more time. And I'm going to slow down so you can get it. If you just do the homework on yourself, everything else around you will come out okay. Did everybody get that? Put that in the chat if you're on Facebook or YouTube with us tonight. You can only control what you can control. And as you study your own emotional intelligence, as you, in the words of Dr. Bryant here, journey back to yourself, is what she says in this book called Homecoming. As you journey back to yourself, you will eventually realize that as you relate to yourself, you can then relate to others. The challenge with some of us, and the reason we experience anxiety, is because we are not tapped into our most authentic and higher self. You have learned how to perform in such a way that your performance has even fooled you. But what Dr. Bryant is trying to help us to understand is that you don't have to pretend, but that when you tap into your own emotional intelligence and you can regulate your own feelings, then you open up yourself to relate to others in a more profound and practical way. And not only do you take your experiences as valid, but you can validate the experiences of other people. Here's what Dr. Bryant says on page 74 of her book, Homecoming. She says, your emotional self-awareness is your ability to recognize how you feel. Your emotional self-awareness is your ability to recognize how you feel. And what I discovered years ago is my therapist asked me a question one day when I was in the midst of depression. She said, Kenny, how are you feeling? And I began to describe to her in paragraphs with a stream of consciousness all of the things that I was working on at work and how productive I had been. And my therapist leaned back in her chair and said, I'm going to ask you the question again. She said, you told me what you've been doing, which is a functional analysis. I didn't ask you how you were doing. I said, how are you feeling? And many of us are not able to tap into our feelings, and many of us are not able to answer the question when somebody says, how are you, not what are you doing, but how are you feeling? Many of us have lost the ability, or we have not taken the time to curate the ability to recognize how we feel. How do you feel as a consequence of what has happened to you? How do you feel as a consequence of the job letting you go? How do you feel as a result of being on the other end of divorce when you said for better or for worse? How do you feel after the loss of a loved one or a pet or something that was meaningful to you? Many of us don't know how to answer the question, how do you feel? And here's what Dr. Bryant says. Many of us have learned how to recite cliches, especially in Black church, right? We always say, I'm too blessed to be stressed. Oh, honey, I'm doing just fine. I'm too anointed to be disappointed. Shut up lying on God. You don't always feel that way. You aren't always blessed. You aren't always stressed. And that doesn't mean that you are any less God-fearing or godly. But what it means is that you are simply human. I'm going to get to that in a minute too. It means that you are simply human. All right. Here's what Dr. Bryant says. She gives us two ways that we can better tap into our emotional selves to better understand our emotional intelligence, which includes anxiety, which includes anger, which includes sadness, which includes joy, which includes sarcasm, which includes grief, which includes insecurity. Here's what she says. She says, it is possible to feel more than one emotion at the same time. If you have not seen Inside Out, you need to go see it, because there is literally a scene where joy and anxiety get into a fight, where joy tackles anxiety and she tells her, you don't get to control who Riley is. I want you to know that it is possible for you to feel multiple emotions at the same time. Let me say it again. Many of you all have experienced this before. It is possible for you to experience multiple emotions at the same time. Many of us oftentimes falsely bifurcate the idea that you can only experience one emotion at the same time. Oh, but I remember a band. by the name of Mays and Frankie Beverly that said, joy and pain are like sunshine and rain. Over and over, you can be sure that where there's a flower, there will be sorrow, but you will endure, because where there's a flower, there's both the sun and the rain. Oh, and it's wonderful because here it is. They're both one in the same. Many of our emotions, as we look back at the feeling wheel, stem from the same place. It is possible to experience both anxiety and insecurity at the same time. And that's what Riley teaches us in the movie Inside Out. Riley teaches us that it's possible for you to experience both joy and anxiety. It's possible for you to experience insecurity and helplessness. It is possible for you to experience serenity and loneliness at the same time. Two things can be true at the same time. And here's what else Dr. Bryant tells us in this book called Homecoming. For those who are just joining us tonight, I highly encourage you all to get this book by Dr. Bryant, the president of the APA. She says, if we say an affirmation that we don't fully believe, it can create more anxiety within us, because then we have created a situation within ourselves where we have to live up to the idea that we have articulated. How you doing, Kenny? I'm doing great. No, you're not. You're falling apart inside. But now that you've said you're doing great, you got to perform socially in such a way that you believe that you're doing great. I've tried to help us tonight, friends, because sometimes the public you and the private you aren't always on the same page. And Dr. Bryant is helping us to understand that if you are going to journey back to yourself, if there is to be any kind of at-homeness, tranquility within yourself, you must be willing to affirm that, one, it's possible to experience more than one emotion at the same time. And two, we have to learn to be honest with ourselves about the emotions that we are experiencing. Very quickly, again, I am not a licensed therapist, neither am I a psychologist nor a psychiatrist, but I have gone through enough semesters of divinity school and seminary to not only serve as a pastor, but to and lived as a human being to be able to serve in some capacity, to offer some resonance or some semblance of ways that we can, again, navigate through the nuances of anxiety. Let's take a look at the sources, the symptoms, and solutions for anxiety, and then I'll jump into the text for tonight very quickly and let you all go. Some of the sources of anxiety. Some psychologists, again, according to the American Psychological or the American Psychiatric Association, would help us to understand that sources of anxiety can be rooted in social isolation, neurochemistry. There are certain neurological pathways within our brain, again, because puberty is a hormone, puberty exposes certain hormones within us, testosterone and estrogen, that was being released within Riley, that was causing new emotions to infiltrate the neural pathways of her brain. Right. And as a teenager, she is still developing. Her brain was still developing. And so as a consequence of her brain still developing, it became a site of terror. Her neural pathways literally created something within her mind that did not exist. And sometimes our anxieties are derived from our own minds. And that's why you got to attend to your inner me and be at peace with your own self. You got to till the inner landscape of your own being, in the words of the theologian Howard Thurman, so that you can experience peace and tranquility and equanimity within yourself. So there's social isolation, there's neurochemistry, but then there's also a source of anxiety is the overindulgence of certain drugs that mess with your mind. And I don't want to go too far into that, but somebody knows what I'm talking about here. If you eat too many edibles or smoke too much weed, or you do too much PCP, or you do so many drugs that it literally can begin to alter your mindset, the neural pathways in your mind, and the medulla oblongata or the pineal gland or the thalamus or it can literally mess with your mind. And so when we talk about Riley's challenge with anxiety, another place that we saw it is that it can stem from childhood trauma. Let me pause right here for a little while because I want to perform surgery on somebody tonight. I want us to get in touch with our childhood self. I want you to go down and pull up those repressed memories that are deeply suppressed within you and ask yourself, why do you act the way you do? Do you realize that most of us as adults are only trying to get back to our childhood selves when we were happy before somebody laid their hands on us, before somebody said something to us that rattled our self-confidence? Many of us as adults have to come to realize that the traumas that we experience as adults is rooted in the horrors we experienced as a child. My God from Zion. Can I say it again? Many of us have come to realize that the trauma that we carry as adults is rooted in the horrors that we experienced as children. And so when we experience anxiety or have anxiety attacks, it might be that something is triggered in you that you never dealt with because you refused to go to therapy, you refused to talk about it, and you walked around, especially as Black men, and said, nah, I'm all right, because of toxic and hyper masculinity to the degree you never dealt with your trauma. And if you don't deal with your trauma is going to deal with you. And so you'll be in your 40s and your 50s and your 60s lashing out on people, and you don't even know who you are because that inner child is screaming for you to help them. I want us to know that one of the sources of anxiety that we experience is unresolved childhood trauma. Get you a therapist and talk it out. And if you gotta cry, then cry till you ain't got no more tears left in your tear ducts to cry. But whatever you gotta do, you better figure it out, because if you don't allow space for your childhood traumas to be talked about, or your social isolation, or the overindulgence of certain drugs, or your declining physical health, or even your changing physical health, or your neuropathy, or the neural pathways that exist in your mind, you're going to always have challenges with anxiety. Those are some of the sources of anxiety. But then what are some of the symptoms of anxiety? Some of the symptoms of anxiety are sweating, and you can't explain why you're sweating. You can't explain why you're nervous. Again, you're about to have a nervous breakdown literally because your nervous system is being overstimulated and overwhelmed. And it may result in some kind of physical change in your body for those who are following on Instagram. It can result in sweating. It can also result in a more increased pace of your heartbeat. Sometimes our heartbeat begins to increase and we don't even know why, because it is anxiety that is deeply rooted within us. Sometimes anxiety shows up as irritability. I told you last week when we talked about anger, sometimes you think you're mad about something and what you're mad about ain't really what you're mad about. So you come home from work slamming doors and slamming pots in the kitchen and cussing your husband or your wife out. And they're looking at you like, what is wrong with you? Because what you're mad about or what you are irritated by or about ain't really what you're mad about or anxious over. So sometimes a symptom of anxiety can be unexplainable irritability. Sometimes anxiety shows up as difficulty concentrating. Sometimes we panic, and panic attacks are very similar to anxiety attacks, though there is an acute degree of separation. Lest I hold you all too long, I'm trying to get you all out of here by 8 o'clock. The sources of anxiety, the symptoms of anxiety, but then the solutions for anxiety, which is where our scripture comes into play tonight that says, be anxious for nothing. Some of the solutions for anxiety, I've said it 1,000 times, I'm gonna say it again, therapy. Okay, if you see a therapist, they may be, I'm not saying that therapy is an end all be all solution, but it can help if you take the time and you have the courage to do it. Therapy, medication. If you go and see a psychiatrist, the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist is between the idea that they can prescribe medications. A psychiatrist can actually prescribe medications. They may be able to give you some medications for, again, the chemical imbalances that you have in your brain, because one of the sources of anxiety is neurochemistry. And if you see a psychiatrist, they can give you the appropriate dosage of medicine that can help relax you a little bit, right? Bring you down a little bit. Some other things are contemplative practices. One of my classmates identified as a Tibetan Buddhist at Harvard Divinity School, and every single day when I got to class, some of my classmates were doing yoga exercises. And I always wondered, why do they do yoga every single day? Same reason some Muslims pray 5 times a day. It's not always out of tradition. It is a centering practice. It is a contemplative practice. Contemplative practices are literally what the name and nomenclature embodies. You are contemplating what it actually means to be in the moment. Yoga, contemplative practices, whatever your hobbies are, water aerobics are a great way to release stress and anxiety, but then also various faith practices as well. What are some faith practices? Singing, prayer, journaling, chanting, meditation. For some people, it may be glossolalia. There's something that is neurological that happens when some people speak in tongues. Whatever the case may be, it's okay for us to think that through. So as we think about solutions for anxiety, let's turn to our text for tonight. And Riley helps to give some more insights for our message in a movie. And I'll be out of your way within the next 10 minutes. Here's what the Apostle Paul says. Paul watched a movie called Inside Out. And Paul said, I wish I could have gotten to Riley, because if I would have been able to get to Riley and I could have got to that emotion by the name of anxiety, I would have told him, hey, I've been there. Paul says, here it is, be anxious for nothing is what I would have told Riley. But in every situation, by prayer and petition, some translations say supplications, with thanksgiving, present your request unto God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I got to say it again. Paul is giving some kind of prescription for the pain tonight. And Paul says that one of the ways that you are able to overcome anxiety from the inside out is to be anxious for nothing. And I'm sitting here reading this text like, hey, brother Paul, you must not have experienced some of the things that Riley experienced. And if you don't know Riley, you must not experience some of the things that I or my people at Beulah ATL or on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube have experienced, because that's real superfluous to tell us to be anxious for nothing. But what I'm trying to help us to understand is, Paul, you ain't keeping it 100% honest, because the reality is there are some biblical characters who even wrestled with anxiety. Last week, we looked at some biblical characters who wrestled with anger, but there are also some biblical characters who had anxiety. And I love one of my colleagues at Morehouse College by the name of Professor Ilya Davis, because in some ways we are understanding that we must learn to humanize our heroes. Can I say it again? We must learn to humanize our heroes. Dr. Davis helped us to understand that if you love your heroes, then you must humanize your heroes. And when we look in the Gospel of Luke, somewhere around chapter number 10, Jesus has an encounter with 2 women by the name of Mary and Martha. And Martha just won't sit down. Martha is walking all around the house, sweeping under every rug, mopping every single floor, washing every one of the dishes, drying all the dishes, putting them up and Jesus comes in and says, Martha, Martha, sweetheart, sit down. I understand you may be dealing with anxiety, but you're going to drive yourself to a place of no return, because there are biblical characters who have wrestled with anxiety. Jesus, the hypostatic union of Jesus. Yes, he was 100% divine, but y'all, Jesus was 100% human. And I believe that Jesus also experienced some anxiety in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Matthew chapter number 26, we can make an argument. It can be argued or inferred that Jesus had anxiety. When you read the Gospel of Matthew, read the text carefully, because as he was nearing the end of his life, he was so anxious that he actually began to have some physical changes. One of the symptoms of anxiety is a change in physical appearances or one's physical health. And Jesus's physical health began to change, because the Bible says he cried so hard that he had drops of blood. He sweated drops of blood. But then not only did we experience Martha having anxiety, Jesus having anxiety, but then Pastor Paul, the Apostle Paul, has anxiety during a number of his ministry missives, as he is found in the book of Philippians and in the book of Corinthians, as he writes to those who are at Corinth in house churches, and as he writes to those who he has partnered in the gospel with and at the church at Philippi. We discover that Paul has wrestled with the challenges and the nuances of anxiety. He's dealt with the adversity of anxiety. And here's what the Bible says is his response to Riley, you and I. He says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything through prayer and supplication with the spirit of thanksgiving, make your requests known unto God. Very quickly, who is the Apostle Paul? Paul was a political prisoner of the state in Rome who's partnered with various churches and individuals throughout the Greco-Roman Empire and Asia Minor to spread the gospel. Paul has been trying to do everything right, and as a consequence of him doing everything right, it seems as though everything has gone wrong. Have y'all ever been there where you tried to do everything right and somehow or another things kept going wrong in your life? You went to school, but you still didn't get hired for the job. It just seems as though you do what's right, but things still keep going wrong. That's where Paul is. According to Dr. Walter Wilson, who is a professor of New Testament at Emory University, Candler School of Theology, Dr. Wilson helps us to understand through a particular theological framework that Paul not only was a political prisoner of the state, according to the challenges of the history of the Greco-Roman Empire, but Paul's letters were considered to be politically subversive to the empire of Rome in and of itself. So not only was Paul a political prisoner, but Paul's letters were thought to be subversive to the institution in and of itself, that is Rome, to the empire of Rome. And that alone will cause you to have anxiety, because he's tried to do things right and it feels as though things keep on going wrong. And unfortunately, around 67 AD, we discovered that this emissary prophet is eventually executed as a martyr by the Roman Emperor Nero, and his anxiety was right. But even though his anxiety may have been right in the sense that something can go wrong, Paul helps us to understand some very practical principles. No, I got two things for you and I'm out of your way in the next 4 minutes. Paul helps us to understand that if you are going to overcome anxiety and you are going to get a hold on your emotional intelligence, it requires you to be prayerful, not pitiful. I want to say it again. Paul helps us to understand that if you're going to overcome the emotional blockage or the emotional challenges from the inside out of anxiety, it requires you to be prayerful and not pitiful, because I've discovered nobody RSVPs to a pity party. And I'm not saying that disrespectfully. I'm not saying you can't fall apart and have your moment, have your day, have your week, have a bad year. But here's what Paul says. He says, be anxious for nothing. The word anxious in Greek is displayed on the screen for you, merino, and it literally means to be troubled with cares, or to be restless, or to be pursuing one's own interest. The reason some of us, just like Riley in the movie Inside Out, are anxious and restless is because we are pursuing our own interest, and it may wear you out. You are troubled down with the things that you really should not be carrying. Put down every weight that would so easily beset you and be prayerful in all things. That doesn't mean that you are overly pious. It doesn't mean that you are overly religious. But here's what a wise man once said. A wise man once said that worrying does not take away tomorrow's troubles, but worrying takes away today's peace. And that leads us to point number 2, that you ought not only be prayerful as opposed to being pitiful, but you ought to seek to be peaceful and not powerful. Those of us who try to control everything want to be in power. And Paul helps us to understand you ought not seek to be powerful. You ought to seek to be peaceful in all things. The word peaceful here is irene in the Greek, and it literally transliterates to the English as a state of tranquility. In other words, Paul says your objective in every situation is to be as calm and tranquil as possible. It literally helps us to understand better the imagery of a soda bottle and a water bottle. When you shake up a water bottle and take the top off, nothing is going to come out. But if you shake up a soda bottle and then take the top off, it's going to explode everywhere, because what's on the inside of you is eventually going to come up on the outside of you. And what Paul is saying is that for those of us who are peaceful, we're more like the water bottle. And those of us who are trying to be powerful, we're more like the soda bottle. The more you shake them up and then you open them up, the more they go off, the more they cuss folk out, the more they want to hit somebody and take off their earrings in the parking lot and do this and do that. But Paul says, oh, no, no, no. The objective is not to be pitiful, it's to be prayerful. The objective is not to be powerful, it is to be peaceful. And I leave you with this tonight. When peace like a river attendeth my way, and sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Y'all know I'm Baptist and I can't just end with one hymn. I got to go to one of my grandmama's favorite ones. My grandmama and them down at Mount Ararat used to sing the song, oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pains we often bear. All because we do not take everything to God in prayer. Friends, all I'm trying to tell you tonight is that if you're going to live from the inside out and learn to manage your emotions, be prayerful, not pitiful, be peaceful, and not seeking to be powerful. Here are some questions for our consideration tonight. In what ways does your faith help you when it comes to anxiousness? I want to ask that question again. In what ways does your faith help you when it comes to anxiousness? Number two, here's the second question. In what ways might it be harming to me when it comes to my anxiety? What ways might some of your religious practices actually be harmful and not helpful? Again, Dr. Bryant helps us to understand that it is important to lean into all of our emotions. All right. And so some of our religious practices may actually be more harmful than they are helpful. In what ways might it be harming me when it comes to my anxiety? And in what ways does your faith help you when it comes to your anxiety? And then question number three, how can I use my faith in ways that can help me to improve my overall mental health and or my emotional intelligence? Again, for those who are watching tonight, I want to recommend this book to all of you all. It's called Homecoming by Dr. Tima Bryant, Homecoming, Overcome Fear and Trauma to Reclaim Your Whole and Authentic Self. If you all have any questions, please email them to me via my email address. My email address is pastor@beulahATL.org. Hopefully this conversation tonight has been helpful and we are able to live our lives from the inside out. And I am happy to announce tonight, as you all have already heard, we are starting a new ministry at Beulah ATL called Grief Share. It begins on Monday, August the 19th, and it concludes on November the 11th, every Monday from 6 to 8 p.m. as we think about the ways to not only embrace our lives from the inside out and become better Rileys and better people, but we want to help you to navigate through the challenges of grief. You may have lost a loved one, you may have lost a friend, you may have lost a pet, you may have lost a coworker. And again, grief is the price that we pay for loving people. And so we want to make sure that we are giving you all of the tools necessary at Beulah ATL to build your holistic self. The workbook is only $20 for a 13-week course. These sessions are 2 hours every night. You can scan the QR code right there. It will take you to our Grief Share registration page. And we hope that you all would join us. Sister Veronica Cox, Deacon Karen Williams, and Dr. Christian Johnson are the leaders of this ministry. And they are some of the most responsible, compassionate human beings that I have ever met and encountered in my life. And I can't wait for you all to walk through this ministry with them. I want to remind you all of some of our upcoming events that are happening at Beulah ATL. We are going to HBCU night at the Battery. We want to be a blessing to the HBCUs, not only in Atlanta, but all across the country. And we want to root for the 2021 World Series champions, our hometown team, the Atlanta Braves, as they take on the Philadelphia Phillies. The tickets are only $45. Tickets are only $45. And that includes a donation that is being made to all of our HBCUs, not only the one at 830 Westview Drive, known as Morehouse College, but Spelman and Clark Atlanta and Morris Brown and Hampton and Howard and Tougaloo and so many other rich institutions that I cannot call a name. We want to invite all of you all. We already have about 30 people signed up for that. We want to bring all of you all out for a night full of family, fun, food, and fellowship, as well as the fact that we also are having our back to school Sunday and free community-wide backpack giveaway on Sunday, August the 4th, immediately following morning worship. All right. We are giving away free school supplies for all of our students who are right there beside us. If we have the capacity, we need you all to make donations. We need your donations. So please contact Deacon in Training, Shar L. Joyner, to make sure that we have enough for them. All right. These are some of the upcoming events that are taking place. And then this Saturday, we are going to actually watch for our Screen on the Green. We're actually going to watch the film Inside Out #1 this Saturday at 7 o'clock in the parking lot of Beulah ATL. That's at 170 at 170 Griffin Street. Lord, y'all got me confusing the address with Morehouse and Beulah. 170 Griffin Street, Northwest Atlanta, Georgia, 30314. We are going to be watching the film Inside Out. So if you have not seen it, we really want you all to come so we can tie all of this good teaching and theology together. And then on Sunday, August the 18th, we are celebrating our 135th church anniversary with Minister Carmen Reed as our guest artist, and none other than the Reverend Dr. John R. Faison Sr. as our guest preacher from the Watson Grove Baptist Church right there in Nashville, Tennessee. Friends, we hope that this has been a blessing. I look forward to hanging out with you all next Wednesday for the third edition and the installment of Word on Wednesday Inside Out. You all be good to